Good evening. Thank you for coming tonight. I'm Ed Feinstein, one of the rabbis here, and this is the second session of our 2024 edition of the VBS College of Jewish Studies. VBS College of Jewish Studies endeavors to offer university-level learning without sororities, football teams, quizzes, or tests. So we're delighted that you're here. Tonight, we're going to continue our conversation that we began last week, reflecting on Israel yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Next week, we will be meeting not on Wednesday, but on Thursday night, the 21st, and our guest will be Donny Massing. Donny Massing is a very, very accomplished Israeli musician and performer, and he's going to be talking to us about the music of Israel yesterday, today, and tomorrow, as we mentioned last week, because if you want to know a people, you have to listen to its music, listen to its poetry, listen to its literature, and engage its culture. So next week, Donnie's going to bring us a conversation about Israeli music yesterday and tomorrow. And then the following week, on March 27th, right? Wednesday night, March 27th, we're going to welcome the Israeli scholar Rachel Korazim, who's the most wonderful scholar of Israeli literature. She's going to appear right on this magic screen. It'll be 7:30 here. It'll be 4 o'clock in the morning where she is, but she's promised to get up in the morning and teach us. And the truth is, I've learned with Rachel at 4 o'clock in the morning, and she's better at 4 o'clock in the morning than most people are at 7:30 at night. So it'll be a wonderful opportunity to talk about contemporary Israeli literature, reflecting on the events of this past year. And then our closing session will be the first week in April. We'll be back with me again, and we'll sum up what we've learned about Israel yesterday, today, and tomorrow. So thank you for joining us tonight. As is our custom, we begin with a prayer of thanksgiving for the gift of being together and the gift of learning together. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu mitzvotav vetzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, shechianu v'kiyamanu v'gianu lazman hazeh. Yaseh shalom, yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael. I want to begin as I began last week with the same kind of introductory comment and request. These issues of Israel, of our Jewish life, of what's going on in the world about us, what's going on in the Middle East and here in America, these are very, very emotionally fraught issues. And many of us have very, very, very strong feelings about these issues. This place is a place of learning. Place of learning means you're going to hear ideas you might agree with, and you're going to hear opinions you might not agree with. That's called education. If you hear an idea you don't agree with, first of all, you should be grateful, because if all you hear is stuff you already agree with, you could have stayed home and watched TV. Instead, you came here to encounter bigger ideas, new ideas, information and perspectives you didn't have before. If you hear ideas you don't agree with, you're welcome to interrogate them by asking a question, by asking for additional facts, by asking the speaker to open up a perspective on things that you might not have had before. And then at the end of the hour, you can either say, I agree with that person, or that person knows nothing. I know a lot more than they do. Maybe the rabbi will invite me to speak the following week. But the one thing you can't do is interrupt, or shout down, or displace that speaker, because that is undemocratic, that is un-Jewish, and that is unwise. That is unwise. We're here to learn. And learning means encountering ideas we didn't come in with. And that's what this whole process is for. If this becomes too hard for you and you're just so filled with emotions because you disagree with every single thing this rabbi is going to say, please take a walk. There's a really nice exhibit on Jewish family life put on by the day school kids in the next room. The House of Pancakes is next door. And there's a pretty decent beer bar right up the street. But please, let the rest of us have this conversation, because I really do believe that in conversation we can grow and learn as a community of friends. And I dearly appreciate your kindness in helping us do that. In May 1967, the armies of Syria, Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, and several other countries gathered on the boundaries of Israel. President Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt ordered the United Nations Security Force that separated those Arab countries from Israel to leave the region. And he started talking about war. Israel did everything it could possibly do to alert the world to what was coming. If you remember those days, some of you are old enough to remember, the great diplomat Abba Eban gave a monumental speech before the United Nations in that beautiful British accent, with that beautiful urbane sensibility. And nobody listened. We really thought that in 67, just 22 years after the end of the Shoah, another Shoah was coming. That the Jews of Israel would be wiped away by these massive armies, and that we would be grieving and mourning. They thought so in Israel too, by the way. And then very, very quickly, as the Six-Day War began, very, very quickly, that whole perspective changed. The Israeli armies the Israeli Air Force took the skies. The Israeli armies streaked across the Sinai Desert. The Israeli tank forces took the Golan Heights. And despite the Prime Minister Levi Eshkol's entreaties to the Jordanian king, King Hussein, not to enter the war, Hussein entered the war. So Israeli forces took the old city of Jerusalem and then took that area that's called the West Bank or the territories or Shomron and Yehuda, whatever you prefer to call them. And suddenly, everything changed. Within days, everything changed. Israel changed. Its territory was increased threefold. Israel suddenly found itself in possession of territories that it only dreamed about. Israel found itself a regional military power. But not just Israel changed. The Sunday that followed the war, I was picked up early from Hebrew High. We were going to Hebrew High at what was then called VJCC. Today it's called Adar Ariel. And I was driven by my carpool family down to the Hollywood Bowl for the great Los Angeles rally in favor of Israel. The Hollywood Bowl seats what? 40,000 people showed up. Luckily, we showed up really early and got really good seats, sitting among the whole Jewish community of LA, right? There was lunch prepared by 40,000 Jewish mothers. A piece of pound cake, some rogalach. It was a machaya. And then the show began. The presentation on the stage was emceed by Ross Martin, who I knew from the Wild Wild West. And every Hollywood star I knew was on that stage. Frank Sinatra sang the national anthem. Barbra Streisand sang Hatikva. And every Hollywood star. And what was remarkable about that is that they all came out of the closet that day. Jerry Seinfeld might not be anybody's idea of a religious Jew, but the fact that he's Jerry Seinfeld and not Jerry Stevens is a very important indication of what that day did to us. Because on the stage came Burt Lancaster and Kirk Douglas, Isur Danelovich, and every Hollywood star you'd ever heard of, and proclaimed their loyalty to the Jewish people and to Israel. On that day, Hollywood came out of the closet. I didn't know Frank Sinatra was Jewish. Who knew that? On that day, The mayor of LA, Sam Yordi, who had the interesting distinction of not being able to pronounce the name of the city he ruled over, the mayor of Los Angeles, Senator George Murphy, who was once a dancer with Shirley Temple, and Governor Ronald Reagan all spoke about their support and love for the Jewish people and for Israel. Everyone spoke about their love of the Jewish people in Israel. The Six-Day War didn't just change Israel. It changed us. It changed American Jewry's self-perception. It's changed our self-image. No longer would we be imagined as old Jewish men with long beards. Now, I put up a poster. I was in high school. I put up a poster in my bedroom of Moshe Dayan, a badass Jew. Had an eye patch that he earned in the 56 campaign and a revolver on his hip. And the idea that there was a badass, I can use that phrase, I think, a rather aggressive Jew, put it that way. It completely changed our image of who we were. We will no longer be victims. And while there'll be martyrs to the Jewish people and to Jewish cause, there'll be Kiddush Hashem, martyrdom is no longer the highest form of Jewish expression. Self-defense, assertion, chutzpah would be the highest form of Jewish self-expression. It changed our self-image. I got to school on that Monday, and the kids who used to beat me up in gym class were suddenly respectful. Things changed for us substantially after that moment. Things are changing for us substantially after October 7th. Probably not as benign ways as they were in Six-Day War. We all know about anti-Semitism that surrounds us. We all know about the vulnerability of Israel. How will things change? How will things change? So in addition to talking about how Israel changes, which we did last week and we'll do next week, I wanted to talk about how we're changing. And so I went and found a good friend, Professor Steve Mueller, former professor of communal service at Hebrew Union College, and then dean of Hebrew Union College in Los Angeles, widely respected scholar of Jewish communal life. He's my walking partner on Shabbos afternoon, which is why I got him here. And what's wonderful about Steve is that all of us have intuitions about how Jewish life is going to change. All of us have opinions about Jewish life is going to change. All of us know for sure, well, at least our mother-in-laws do, about how Jewish life is going to change. Steve actually knows, because he's a very, very careful scholar who gathers this data and studies this thing with great sober care and sober meticulousness. And that's what I wanted to offer tonight. So I asked Steve to come and talk to us. How are we changing? How will American Jewish life change? How will our lives and the lives of our kids change after these events of October 7th and this past year? Please welcome my dear friend, Professor Steve Windmuller.
Thank you, Rabbi Feinstein, and good evening to all of you. Please don't worry about this board. This will simply be my tool. If you can't see it but are curious about it, we can arrange for this PowerPoint to be shared. It's certainly a public document. So our goal this evening, as Rabbi Feinstein pointed out, is to really dig more deeply into the concepts of what is happening to us as a result of these events. And I think it's important to realize that in so many ways, this is almost a counterpoint to 1967. This is the other side, if you wish. So I'm going to be speaking for about 25 minutes, and I'm going to try to deal with a lot of material. And at that point, Rabbi Feinstein and I will engage in a dialogue where he'll beat me up and disagree with me, challenge me, and I'll look to you to help me. Okay, so let's begin. There is no question that what this moment has been about is fundamentally a redefinition of who we are. Part of that is that the fundraising and financial roles that we have played from October 7th forward is singularly the most powerful expression of Jewish solidarity with the people of Israel and with global Jewry that we have ever seen. So the numbers themselves are telling us Jews care, and their dollars were part of that expression of commitment. That's a very important principle, because non-Jewish elites, governors, congresspersons, even presidents, look at what the Jewish community actually does rather than what it says. And the financial expectations or capacities were demonstrated. The second is certainly that in the first days following this event, the trauma, the terror, and the emotional response drove us to build a kind of coalition of unity. And we saw that in the huge numbers of gatherings across the United States, for that matter, across the globe. The reality of that was that on the 14th of November, we came together in Washington and 300,000 of us would gather. And that was the apex, if you wish, the key moment of where that solidarity held us together. In reality, since the 14th of November, we have begun to see some fissures, some divisions, and we'll talk about those, what they mean and why they have evolved. But it is important to realize that we are in a different series of stages from the 7th of October to the 14th of November and to other moments in time where we've seen these different points of division and coalition being present. Our own sense of self was in part seen by what I call here the return. We'll come back to that in a moment. But the core idea here is that many folks who were marginal to their Jewishness and to the Jewish community returned home. Part of that has been about anti-Semitism, and part of it is about the quest to understand Israel in our lives, Zionism in the context of the Jewish story. No doubt, the biggest news story that we contend and live with daily is what is happening to our kids and grandkids on college campuses. That story is a continuous one and a problematic one. What it suggests to us is that this is a problem that is not to be sort of universalized. There are particular universities where this sort of momentum of hate is happening. And there are other places where we hardly see or contend with these kinds of problems or anti-Zionism. Another one of those expressions for us is what has happened and which you will hear in your third session or fourth session, dealing with the music, the poetry, the literature over these last 4.5, 5 months. The 150 plus days of this moment, of this experience, has generated an extraordinary amount of response, of personal efforts to write down, to verbalize, to create the music, the culture, and the story of what this all may mean to us, what it may mean for Israelis, and how, in a sense, it symbolizes the whole question of how do we understand the hostage scenario. And then we turn to our neighbors and what we call the Great Silence, many who did not step up, many who were not there for us, many of whom who were part of our interfaith and intercommunity work, but were simply not present in those days following the 7th of October. And that's a story unto itself, which is going to require a lot more sort of perspective and engagement. And finally, there is the effect, and that is, what is this doing to us? The trauma, the emotion, the anger, and the uncertainty. And that will be, in the end, how we want to find our way moving forward. Sorry. The awakening, which is the return. Here I've talked to many rabbis and educators and community professionals, and they're telling me all the same story. Early on, folks began to call, to come to synagogues, to go to federations, to create a connecting point for folks who were marginal to the Jewish community. And this is a story that will evolve and build over time. How do we hold them? How do we engage them? And in what ways are they asking, what does it mean to be Jewish in this moment? And that will be the outcome here for many folks who, for the first time, have been awakened to the sense that something is happening, both positive and negative, in their context and in their identity. In many ways, I think we feel compelled to be together and feel the sense of togetherness, even as we gather in this study. But we also feel very alone, in the sense that the world is really not there. The world has sort of dissipated its support, in fact, has moved to a point of condemnation. And that becomes troubling and anguishing and certainly challenging for us. But it takes us back in history, because we were always a people that was marginalized. And there is increasingly in the minds of some historians and political scientists the belief that we are returning to a place in Jewish history where we always had found ourselves in a kind of context of feeling alone, of being despised, of being abused. And that too will be something we will talk about. Indeed, I think for some of us, we know about the political divisions, both inside the Jewish community and beyond, and those are difficult for us to navigate, but they are very real and speak to institutional positioning, to historic roles played by various organizations about how they understood Zionism, how they see the state of Israel, or how they refute the state of Israel in this context. And so with groups that have long opposed the settlements in the territories and have all long been in opposition to the current regime, this is simply their moment of acting to restate their displeasure. I think for all of us, when we watch news programs and listen to commentators and journalists, we get this sense of the absence of context, that so few reporters and analysts have a rich understanding of how complex the Middle East is, and for that matter, how complex the story of the Jewish people and the state of Israel represents. And that becomes for us a particularly difficult moment as we watch on our networks and journalistic programs, the inability to really put things into the context of history. I wanted to point out that what we have seen, of course, and the ADL and the American Jewish Committee and the Simon Wiesenthal Center and others document this regularly, is the explosion of hate that we are experiencing and seeing. And I've just snapshotted a period of 1 month where the ADL monitored in a 30-day period the extraordinary set of incidents of anti-Semitism, harassment and abuse, and even violence. ADL ranks things on the basis of assault, vandalism, and harassment, and noted that on average there were as many as 28 incidents a day just during that 1 month period. And noted as well, of course, the extraordinary acceleration in the numbers of incidents, which now, of course, continue, and where the federal government, as well as other institutions, continue to give us updates on that experience. I think for our community, the notion that is reported here that 3 out of every 4 of our students on college campuses is experiencing or has felt some form of this anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic response. And overall, while this study suggests 70% of Americans are concerned about Jew hatred, we know that that number has actually gone up from studies we have of the general public. And of the Jewish public, over 90% of American Jews indicate that they are feeling concerned. I want to put in some good news here, because the perception is there that the world is against us. Well, much of the world is against us, but the reality is that there's a lot of good data about American public opinion on Israel. Ever since the State of Israel was created and through these events, the support for Israel continues to be significant among American audiences. Look, if 59% of Americans support foreign aid is a very unpopular item in the American budgetary choices. And yet, nearly 60% of our fellow citizens say this is important, and aid to Israel is particularly important. Also of importance to understand that you have significant numbers of people believing in the importance of humanitarian assistance, and we need to deal with that. What does that mean? How does that get played out? And of course, that is all part of the current moment of when do you create a ceasefire and how do you implement a kind of humanitarian assistance package. And certainly that 83% of Americans believe that what happened on October 7th was a terrorist event. So I think we need to put this in context, and then we're going to step back and point to a serious and challenging problem. Younger Americans, and also younger American Jews, have a far less degree of sympathy, engagement, and support for the State of Israel. And the data here is profoundly challenging to us. In an article that I did with Jonathan Kessler of AIPAC, we took a look at the numbers of letters that young Jewish activists are writing to their movements, the United Synagogue and to the Reform Movement, and to their organizations that they work for, or to the schools that they attended, the day schools that they had attended, critical of the way they were taught about Israel and how they understand Israel. Now that's just inside the Jewish world, but outside of the Jewish world, we all already know that under Gen Zs and millennials have a far less affinity to support of Israel and a much higher degree of sympathy for Palestinians and for the case in Gaza. So all of this begins then to raise a series of questions, part of which is about, as Jews and as Zionists, what is the room for dissent? What within our world are we able to agree upon and believe is acceptable discourse? And where do we cross the boundaries of that discourse? That becomes one of the central questions that I think now troubles us and sometimes divides us, and sometimes we simply walk away from any conversations that deal with these dilemmas. But the larger set of issues will begin now to appear in the 2024 election, because none of this remains as part of just a discourse about Jews and Israel and Zionism. It will become part of the larger fabric of a conversation that will occur on the American stage in preparation for November. It will come from the progressives on the left, and it will come from some on the far right who are isolationists, and we will begin to see the question that is going to be challenging to us about where we fit into the American political landscape as we go through this election. It is a question of whether Jews are white. Now, on the far left, the perception is that Jews who were once a minority and once a petitioning group seeking power, seeking authority, have become white. And the left will challenge us on the basis that we are the powerful. We control the Congress. We are in the Congress. And we are profoundly influential financially, culturally, and politically. We are white. And on the far right, the alt-right and the white supremacists charge us as being replacing them. Remember Charlottesville? You shall not replace us. The replacement theory is that Jews are seeking to become Anglo-Saxons, to be the Anglo-Saxons, the white folks, taking control and imposing their agenda and their people, meaning our allies, our coalition partners, whether they're African Americans or Latinos or Asian Americans or others whom we are perceived as somehow in coalition with on these questions of power. So whiteness then becomes a major challenge as we go forward toward November. And then there are the internal questions about the Zionism that we thought we had created. Our kids returned to us with this following notion. You told us that we should think of Tikkun Olam, repairing the world. But when it comes to Israel, you tell us, no, that's not the message we're giving you. The message we're giving you on Israel is to be particular, to be of concern to your brothers and sisters. And therefore, there is a different scale of measure, of commitment. And they are pushing back. And they are saying to us, we don't think Israel is repairing the world. We think it is disruptive to the world. And they are challenging us on this very notion of the Zionism that we thought we had taught or were trying to convey to them. And so that will become a piece of the story of how we rebuild the Zionist question of what it is. And inside Israel is an interesting debate as well. How could this event have happened on the 7th of October? Wasn't this country designed to protect the first job it was committed to is the defense of its people, and yet its people were not protected. And so there is a debate inside Israel itself over this question of whether or not the Zionist story of the ingathering of the Jewish people and the security of the Jewish people was, and in fact, preserved in this moment. So these become our challenges as we move forward. But there are larger issues that I think we will not deal with this evening, but just to put in context. You cannot talk about the Gaza-Israel conflict without talking about Iran, or talking about United States interests in the larger Middle East, or to understand the role of Saudi Arabia, or to deal with the whole array of the superpower conflicts that are playing out inside the Middle East. We believe, and I'm sure you've heard this, that Israeli intelligence and other intelligence agencies knew that there would be at some point an effort to attack Israel, whether it was constructed around the particular set of events we saw on the 7th of October, unclear. But what we did understand, that Iran had intended this event that occurred on Simchat Torah to take place on Pesach, and then called it off for various reasons. But the symbolism of doing this event on a Jewish holiday or on Shabbat itself is profoundly important, because our enemies understand that there is something important about calling out or defining the challenges that they have with the Jewish state by attacking the state on one of its sacred days and observances. The second principle is, if you have not read the Hamas Charter, you need to do so, because it's the definition of anti-Semitism. 13 references to the Jewish people, the state of Israel, the global Jewish community, to understand that this is not simply a war of liberation, it's not simply over territory, it is over the destruction of a people. So to put that all in context, to realize that the Middle East has many different components to it, and we are in the midst of one of those storylines. As many of you know, the Saudis were in negotiations with the United States over a three-part deal. Over the past 7 to 8 months, Washington and Riyadh and even Jerusalem were talking about this three-pronged arrangement. Washington would give the Saudis a security agreement, protecting them in terms of Iranian influence. The Israelis would make some gesture to the resolution of the Palestinian question, because the Saudis said no deal without some explanation or a statement committing Israel to a path forward. The Iranians understood that if this deal was consummated, it would strengthen and further involve the United States in the Middle East, and Saudi Arabia in particular would be a key Western ally. So for the Iranians, for Hezbollah and for Hamas and for the Houthis, this was a moment to change the status quo. And that is exactly what we have seen since these events have unfolded. So we say that all in the context that we cannot talk about just the Jewish question without understanding the broader implications of international affairs and the interests of other countries. I think, where do we go from here? I think this is all about, first and foremost, our security, the security of our kids, the security of others that we care about, and that is both on the Israeli front as well as here amongst all of us and our communities and congregations. It is about education. It is the education that we need to do at home with our kids, in our schools, reframing the Zionist story in a way that works and will work for them and for us, and reminding ourselves that the notion that Israel was invincible and that Israel is secure is no longer a given, and that a country surrounded, as it still is, but by a different set of challenges and enemies, some of which have the capacity to deliver potentially nuclear weaponry. And then it's about advocacy and partnerships, those that we've lost and those that we need to regain, and new ones that we have to uncover. And part of that will be the storyline of what did we do, or what did we fail at in terms of what happened over these past months, and why have so many folks sort of seen the other side as the cause célèbre, as the case to be made, and the case for Israel is simply diminished. So there's a lot of pre-planning as well as proactive engagement. But it will also be memorializing. We do not want to lose this moment about how we feel, what has happened, what still is happening, and to the state and hopes we have for the 140-odd hostages. And we want to understand the economic and social implications of this, the longer-term ones, because what we have dealt with over these past 150-odd days is the immediacy of needs. And now we have to look at Israel and our needs going forward. Many of our institutions in this country stopped their fundraising in order to permit and advance the cause of the needs of Israel, the Israel Trauma Center, the Israel Red Cross, the American Friends of Israel Defense Forces, our Federation campaigns for the Jewish Agency and the JDC and so forth. But what now is called upon is how do we make sure that our home institutions, our schools, our camps, our agencies of social and human services are going to be secure as well. And how do we plan for the future in terms of both our political priorities, but also our crisis management? We need to be in crisis mode or be prepared for crisis mode in a future moment. And I don't know that we are. In so many ways, this is very personalized. It is not the institutions. It's not about politics, and it's not about the Zionist debate. It's about the lives that are changing, the emotions that we carry, the feelings and the anger and the frustrations that we are living with. And that becomes part of how our institutions can hold us. And classes like this and efforts to create trips to Israel and to build a sense of unity and community are all critical to that. And we have to ultimately, as our goal moves forward, to think about how we see ourselves in the larger world. Because in some measure, we are diminished, whether we feel it or whether the world itself is telling us. Our credibility, our messaging, our story has somehow become tarnished. And that's going to be challenging for us to hear and for us to believe. So, Rabbi, I've pretty well depressed. Now I pretty well depressed everyone. So we've got to rebuild this rather quickly, or otherwise we're in trouble.
Okay, come. Thank you. Have a seat.
Now, you guys know that you have to use the mic.
Yeah, we will use the mic. We will use the mic. Okay. I just want you to notice something. How many of you remember, I used to do a Torah study class in this room before we remodeled. And you always remember that 20 minutes in, I had to mess with the thermostat. So I want you to see we did $1 million renovation, but the same damn thermostat is right. So if you're cold or hot, that's the tradition here at Valley Beth Shalom. In case you worry that, so much is changing, new synagogue, new rabbi, new cantor, same old crappy thermostat. Good. Well, thank you, Steve. Thanks so much. I got lots of questions. I'm going to ask Steve a few questions. He may ask me a few questions. Then we'll ask you some questions. And then we'll... Okay. This is Alana. We're online, so the world is watching. So in the mid-1990s, there was a political scientist by the name of Frank Fukuyama, who wrote a very important treatise where he said, this is the end of history. And what he meant by that was, with the fall of the Soviet Union and the rise of liberal democracies around the world, he said the great struggles of the 19th and 20th centuries have come to an end. Liberal democracy has won. And now it's a question of just mopping up and figuring out the details. He probably was a little wrong about that. But the reason I raise it is because I think in some ways, many of us had the same assumption when it came to Jewish history. I went to a Hebrew school where I knew the names of all of the great tyrants who destroyed Jewish life, right? Starting with Pharaoh and Haman and Nebuchadnezzar and Titus. I can do this for you all night. And Torquemada and all of the Nazis. And that was my Hebrew school education. But as I grew into Jewish adulthood, it was very clear the ideology of our community was, that was then, this is now. That was there, this is here. I live in a time when that kind of stuff, Jew hatred, isn't my problem anymore. My problem is how to get my grandchildren to choose to be Jewish. It's an internal question of identity, not an external question of defense. October 7th came and has shaken us so deeply. And the question is this really the end of that kind of thinking? Are we reverting, as you said, I think you put it in this language, are we reverting to the norm? Are we reverting to the norm of Jewish history when Jewish communities were always somewhat afraid? Or put it the other way, did I grow up in a bubble, in a very unique bubble in Jewish history of safety, security, acceptance, freedom, prosperity? And now that bubble has, as it were, popped, and we've gone back, we reverted to the mean is the right word. We reverted to the way it always was. Is that our now perception of who we are?
Yes. So you cited a political scientist. I'm citing a historian. Simon Montefiore has a new historical book out entitled The Family History of Man, in which Montefiore suggests that the 70 years since the end of the Second World War, roughly.
Sorry, that mic isn't the mic that amplifies, so we need it feeds into the recording, but we need you to amplify.
All right.
Think of it as a bar mitzvah lesson.
It just means that everybody really wants to hear you.
So Montefiore suggests that the 70-year period was a unique moment. And it was unique in so many ways because he said, yes, there was conflict, but not nearly the kind of global conflict we'd known in history. Yes, there was anti-Semitism, but not the caliber and scale of it. And what we are reverting to, because of the changes in governments and in politics today, as you see the rise of national conservatism and the growth of right-wing governments and authoritarian governments, his argument is this is changing the landscape, not just for Jews, but for societies. And therefore, we are returning to a point and place in history that we once observed as the norm. So yes, this is a difficult moment.
So what do you do about that?
The rabbi asked, what do you do about it? I think what it means is that we first call it out. We have to tell ourselves this is a different moment in time. And we have to work with that. We have to understand that how we educate kids, how we talk to one another, how we understand the idea of a Jewish state at this moment as against maybe 25 or 30 years ago, and what our dreams were for it and about it have radically changed. I think it's a coming to grips with a different mindset about the Jewish story.
I want to go to another one of the points that you made, which I think is something many of us can identify with. Many of us have children who are, of that Generation XZ ilk, and they have very different ideas about Jewishness, about Israel, about Zionism, about the world than we do. And the frustrate, if you haven't had this experience, I recommend it to you highly. Try explaining to them. Because facts aren't the issue. Something else is at issue. Tell us what else is at issue. Why is it that we walk with a certain sense of the necessity of a Jewish state, the deep value of a Jewish place in the world, deep value of Israel? Why do we get teary-eyed when we hear Hatikva? And they have a very different attitude about the whole matter.
Actually, the Jewish population study of LA that was done several years ago points to what Rabbi Feinstein is talking about, that 18 to 35-year-olds have a very different sort of mindset about Jewishness. First of all, it's not institutionally tied. They don't belong to synagogues for the most part. It's not tied to the same kinds of charitable and communal and cultural enterprises that are ours, but they have their own. And according to the folks at Brandeis who did this study, they hold to the view that these folks are actually outperforming older folks in terms of the kinds of Jewish actions and activities that they are engaged with. So what do? They are creating their own sort of cultural journeys. They're going to film festivals, and they're foodies, and they are curious about Jewish foods. They are looking at Jewish history, but through a lens that doesn't tell them about sorrow, pity, and anguish, but talks to them about other themes having to do with the assertion of individuality, the ability of people who rose above those conditions to create their own ways forward. So their mindset is individualized. It's tied to social media. It's tied to friendships and communal systems that they are building themselves. And it's linked in many ways to a kind of countercultural Judaism that's so very different from the ways in which we sort of were programmed. I don't know the effects of October 7th on their lives yet. And I don't know that we know the data on that. But what I think we will begin to see is that some of those sort of independent and individualistic notions will begin to come home. That is, they will begin to sort of ask the old questions and start to rethink what it may mean to be part of community. And some will walk away because Israel is for them, a parasite. Israel is problematic. Israel doesn't give them hope. It's seen as the other. And it may not be part of their Jewish consciousness. And maybe they were oversold Israel, or they were sold an Israel that was something very different from what it is showing itself to be.
So let's stay with kids for a minute. American Jewish kids are told which university they're going to attend at their bris. We're going to circumcise you and hand you papers to get you into Yale. That was certainly my case. It wasn't even a question. My dad, some of you know my dad, he's a lovely, lovely soul. And he said, Ed, you can be anything you want in the world after you finish your PhD, right? So university education has become a sine qua non of American Jewish development, American growth. And for the first time, we have had this profound experience that universities were not safe for Jewish kids. We're not places that Jewish kids can thrive. Jewish kids are having a very hard time in many, many universities. How does this change? How does this change us? How does this change the trajectory of Jewish life? What do I say to my kids? So my kids are out of college, my grandkids now. What do I say to them about their future?
I think part of this is what we're already beginning to see. I'm involved with the Church of Latter-day Saints. No, I'm not a Mormon. I've been talking to the folks at BYU.
It's you and your 3 wives.
Yes, right. And what I hear from my friends at Brigham Young is, we're going to be making a market to Jewish audiences in California and in the East Coast because we are a safe place. And other universities tied to Christian and to sort of traditional value systems are going to play this because they see an opportunity here to replace Harvard, Penn, Columbia, and other such institutions. So we're going to part of that is going to be who else rises out of the educational world. The other side to this is that, yes, we always thought our kids would be going to college. We now have some new data that gap year programs are working so well that a lot of kids are saying, I'm not sure I really need college, and certainly didn't find college helpful during COVID. And therefore, I'm going to try another way of growing my role in the world. And so we're beginning to see some real interesting data of the decline of college admissions, fewer students applying, and looking at other ways of growing their talents, working on their job, being, an intern, creating other forms of their own industries, because a lot of the folks who created, as we know, the tech world really were dropouts and created that out of a different context of how to learn and grow.
So more about that's coming. I'm sure you'll have some questions about that. I want to revert now to the bigger picture for a second, and ask kind of a simplistic question, but I know that you'll find great depth to answer it. The anti-Semitism that we are experiencing now, was that caused by this event, catalyzed by this event, or simply exposed by this event? In other words, was it always there, waiting for something to tear the sort of gentility off the top so that you could see it? Was it there in latent form and this event catalyzed it, gave it a form that people could sort of express it? Or did new anti-Semites grow since October 7th?
Well, I think the engine that has driven this is social media, but the anti-Semitism actually was there. And the newest data that ADL just put out last week with its conference in New York on March 6th and 7th, that data is frankly very discouraging because it tells us that younger Americans have a much higher degree of anti-Semitism. ADL uses 11 points on a chart of Jews stick together too much, Jews control too much, Jews are more loyal to Israel than their home country, and it goes on. And if you score 6 or more on this chart, you are identified as anti-Semitic or likely to be anti-Semitic and so forth. So 24% of Americans are now classified as holding 6 or more of those views, but it's a higher percentage of younger Americans. So I think it's there, and it's been there. And what the data is suggesting is these people are telling us in surveys, well, in our family, 42% of our relatives believe don't like Jews, or something to that effect, or other numbers that point to the fact that it's been there, but the nature of our society has changed so much that all of that sort of genteel quality of, well, we don't talk about those people that way, that conversation now is very much raw and alive and unfortunately very present. The difficulty here is not about the 24% of Americans, which is literally millions of people. It's about the Lone Rangers, about folks who are going to act on that, as we saw in Pittsburgh, or saw in Poway, or saw in other settings. And that's what becomes particularly nervous and scary to security institutions protecting synagogues or to other facilities.
So let's pursue that a moment. Americans in general, and American Jews even more so, have this idea that any social problem should be addressed with education, right? In other countries, you have revolution. We write a course. We have education. Can education change that trajectory? Can education change anti-Semitism? Or are these attitudes somehow, I don't know, metaphysically ingrained somehow, genetically ingrained? Can you fix this? Can we do something about this?
So I think 2 weeks ago in the Jewish Journal, I wrote a piece which raised the question, can, all the millions of dollars we've invested in the fight against anti-Semitism, all the educational interfaith work, all the media work that we've done, it seems to be working in the reverse for us. And the question is, so what do we do? I mean, the education modality was the 1930s. We began that already then in terms of understanding you want to isolate the anti-Semite as if he or she has a disease, and you want to inoculate. These were the language terms used by the national agencies, inoculate people with education so that they would be free of hate. But it is not going to work in a 21st century context, because part of what worked in the 20th century was that elites told us hate is not good. And presidents of the United States and congresspersons and church leaders and business people said, it's not good for America to hate. Nobody listens any longer. Nobody gives a damn what someone may say, because social media has redefined the power linkages. People control their own destiny, determine their own perspectives, and they do not care whether or not a Joe Biden or anyone else would indicate to them that this is not the American way. So I am particularly concerned that we're in for a very long struggle here. Part of it will be this debate over free speech in social media and what are the boundaries of acceptable speech. And that's a tough and difficult course where the courts themselves will have to enter. And the other piece to that is that we are well along in a generation that has a lot of hate and a lot of discomfort and anger, not only with us, but with other communities as well. And we're seeing certain states where LGBTQ folks are really struggling, and we see in other settings where other minorities are facing huge pushback in terms of voter suppression or whatever else may be happening.
So one more question, and this is more of a fetch than a question, but it seems to me that there's been a reversal of field, right? Growing up as an American Jewish kid, I always had a suspicion that evangelical Christians, right-wing Christians, were not good for me, but a university would be safe for me. And now it seems almost the opposite, that I'm a lot safer in an evangelical church than I am in an English class at UCLA. That somehow cultural elites, the most highly educated among us, have adopted attitudes toward Jews and toward Israel, which are really pernicious, and that more down-home folks seem to get along just fine with us. Is that impression a true impression, or is that just my own myopia?
Rabbi, you're partially right. Sorry.
Thank God.
Last week's Jewish Journal piece on the three sort of ideas that are going to dominate the Republican Party in this election: national conservatism, populism, and Christian nationalism. Christian nationalism has some real challenges for the Jewish community because the Christian identity movement, which is part of that, says this is a Christian nation. And all of those ingredients of what a theocracy would look like are really driven by that perspective. So in that sense, I worry about moving our kids only or exclusively into the evangelical world, because part of that world is really quite extreme. But no doubt, the challenge here is that we are homeless. We are homeless educationally and homeless politically, and we are struggling to figure out a way forward, which will probably mean some combinations of things. So I'm not certain that we're going to find that easy, simple road ahead.
So if you're a kid at college and your English professor decides to not teach Milton or Shakespeare or Edna St. Vincent Millay, but instead to hold forth on Jewish oppression of Palestinians, what would you suggest that kid say to that professor? Professor.
Well, I mean, postmodernism, which is where all of this is situated, intersectionality, critical race theory, woke culture, all of those ideologies and ideas are all about really discounting people such as us, because we're in control. We are perceived as powerful. And this whole postmodernist thing has got to be challenged. And if I had a kid in that room, I would hope he or she would articulate to this professor that this is anarchy. This is profoundly the absence of truth. It's denial of truth. And what you're trying to teach us is, in a sense, a kind of self-liberation, that it's all about the individual and their right to take back power or to claim power without any context of coalition or group, because all of the notions of group and coalition run counter to postmodernism, because for them this is all about the well-being of the individual, his or her gender, his or her race, his or her sexuality, all of which play over and above the power of ideas, but the place of the person.
That's an important comment. That was very important and well said. Let's turn our attention to something easy, American politics. You know, all of you know this story, that when Ben-Gurion proclaimed Israeli statehood in May of 1948, 11 minutes later, President Truman recognized the new state of Israel. And he did it against the advice of his Secretary of State, General Marshall, who was the most popular politician in the country. He did it against tremendous pressure in his Congress and in his party. And since then, pressure this way, pressure that way, America has been remarkably supportive of the state of Israel economically, militarily, diplomatically, and in every other way. And as this conflict began, as this catastrophe began, we saw an American president do something, I mean, just remarkable. He got on Air Force One and flew into a combat zone against the wishes of his own security people, because he wanted to show that America stands with Israel. Now there's a bit of a daylight between them. There's some conflict going on. And there's, as you said, isolationism on one side of the political spectrum and deep suspicion of Israel on the other side of the spectrum. So what do you see as the future of America's political and economic and military support for the state of Israel, and what can we do about it?
Well, the good news is that as long as the two current candidates running for the presidency are in power or trying to achieve power, the likelihood of a pro-Israel presidency will continue. It will vary, but obviously, between these two parties. The interesting thing will be to watch the platform debates, especially on the Democratic side. Joe Biden will win that debate, but he will have a huge fight on his hands. And because the progressives and others will be playing to unseat that traditional role of pro-Israel policy inside the Democratic Party. That's the short term. The long term is that I look at the younger American voter and the younger American political mindset, and I'm saying we've got a huge challenge ahead, because it won't show up in the first 5 years, but it could show up well into the next 20 years, that we will see a very different American administration or a very different set of policies for the United States with regard to the Middle East and Israel.
So I want to finish with, I want to invoke my grandmother, who would sit and listen to talk radio. When she lost her eyesight, she would sit and listen to talk radio. In those days, it was a man named Michael Jackson, who, not the singer, the British accented, and I would come for lunch from rabbinical school and eat lunch with Bubby, and Bubby would say, "Oh, Edela, is it good for the Jews?" That was the only question that she wanted to know. You know, whatever was in the newspaper, whatever she heard on the radio, is it good for the Jews? And I want to ask you the same question. Right now, what's good for the Jews? What's most difficult for the Jews? And what do we need to do?
The good stuff is that there are crowds like this all over the country. And I've been teaching on Zoom, and we're getting huge numbers of people talking about these questions. And that's a sign of interest and commitment and trying to find our way forward. And the awakening that I spoke about is a promise, it's a hope that there'll be others joining us and taking lessons and studying about Zionism and Judaism and finding their way into synagogues, into community. And then there are our kids. And there will be the question of how these events will inform them and shape them and hopefully bring them home. But there's no promise of that. That's still an open-ended question. And the tragedy here is that we have known from our history that when we are perceived and seen as marginalized or the other, that we tend to grow our sense of community and grow our sense of solidarity. And that may be the road forward, at least in the short term, of starting, in a sense, picking up the pieces and starting all over again and rebuilding the dream.
In Israel, an interesting thing has happened, and we'll talk about this next week with Donnie Massing, the musician, and the week after with Rachel, who's the literature professor. So in Israel, on October 6th, the day before, there was a palpable sense that the generation of, mostly, they call it Tel Aviv. It's all over the country, but they call it Tel Aviv. The generation that looks at their phones, that looks into their screens, that's highly individualistic, that had lost its patriotism for the country, and that Israel was going to lose that sense of national solidarity and ethos. And the remarkable thing that happened on October 8th is that that generation of Israelis, young Israelis, closed their computers, turned off their phones, picked up weapons, and came to the border. I was talking about this last time. The usual gius rate, when miluim are called up, when reserves are called up, the Israeli army estimates that they'll get 80% of reservists coming to serve. This time they got 130% coming to serve. They had more guys, more soldiers than they knew what to do with. They had more soldiers than they had uniforms for, or Kevlar vests for, or bullets for. I mean, so in Israel, there is a awakening of national solidarity and national service. And the question is, can we see something similar here? And how do we go about making that happen? I want to remind you, we're going to take a few questions. It's a brave thing to do in Jewish audience. But just to remind you once again that next week will be on Thursday night, not on Wednesday night. You can come Wednesday night, We'll have the Jewish Women's Theater is going to be here, and they're wonderful. And they're talking about immigration courage. So stories of immigrants. That's next Wednesday night here. But next Thursday night, we will reconvene right here with Donnie Mossing, this gifted Israeli musician who will talk to us about Israeli music yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And the following week, back on Wednesday again, sorry to confuse you, back on Wednesday again with Rachel Korazim, direct from her home in Yafo at 4:30 in the morning. It'll be 7:30 here to talk about the literature and poetry that has come from Israel. And then the following week, I'll finish together with a talk again about Zionism. We have a few minutes for some questions, not too much. I want to remind you the following, because I'm sorry, but I'm a teacher. I was trained as a junior high school social studies teacher. A question, by definition, is a single sentence interrogatory, beginning with the words what, when, why, where, and how, and whose purpose is to elicit an opinion, perspective, or idea from our guest. It is not your chance to deliver a sermon. If you'd like to deliver a sermon, we would be delighted to hear you. You call the rabbis at Stephen S. Wise Temple, and you tell them that Rabbi Feinstein said that it's your turn to give the sermon, Shabbos, and Rabbi Yoshi, Rabbi Ronnie, they'll be delighted to hear from you. But tonight, a single sentence interrogatory, beginning with what, why, where, when, and how. And if you go past a single sentence, I have the right to say, that's your sentence. So be very careful. Yes, Eileen. I'll repeat the question. Go ahead.
I was going to ask, how do we deal with our 20-something-year-old kids who are saying, oh, we've killed 30,000 Gazans, and we're taking their water, and we're killing our own people that are hostages? How do we deal with it?
I will, let me repeat the question. I'll give you my answer, and then Rabbi Windmuller will give his answer. He's just been ordained. The question is, how do I respond to my 20-something-year-old kid who says you're killing 30,000 Gazans, you're killing off the hostages, you're depriving children of food. What kind of Israel is this? And the quick answer to the question is open today's New York Times and Bret Stephens' column, in which he does exactly that. He takes all of those arguments that you've heard on the street and gives very, very clear, strong, and powerful answers to all of them. So I'll suggest Bret Stephens. Now I'll suggest Professor Windmuller.
I agree. I think Brett did a wonderful job with it.
Yeah, and the answer, Eileen, the answer is, first of all, what I've said to kids, and I've spoken to lots of kids, the essence of moral intelligence is being able to keep two thoughts in your head at the same time. Anyone who can't do that has lost the essence of moral intelligence. So there are two thoughts in my head at the same time. The first thought is that Israel faced a catastrophic moment on October 7th, vicious barbarity beyond anyone's imagination. And the more data that comes, the more vicious we know it was. Vicious, and then a celebration of viciousness beyond your imagination. And so Israel knew that it had to root out this organization, Hamas, because Hamas itself promised that they're going to keep doing this. They don't want coexistence. Hamas is not a coexistence organization. They don't want to live side by side with Israel and build a better Middle East. They want to kill all the Jews they can see. And they're proud when they do it. And so Israel knew that the only way to respond was to respond with enormous force. But when you're fighting a disymmetrical war against a terrorist organization which is so deeply dug into urban centers, and as we know, under urban centers, it's very, 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 very difficult to try to protect civilians and at the same time carry out that mission. And yet both things had to be done. And I believe the Israelis have done as well as anybody in the world, frankly, certainly better than America did in Mosul, right, to do this, right? That's my first thought. My second thought is, yes, you're right. It's a horrifying thing what's happened to Palestinians, innocent Palestinians, children, women, people who are sick, elderly. It's a horrifying thing. And I'm grateful that the President of the United States and the world has demanded humanitarian aid. And that's beginning to happen now because Israel has quelled most of Hamas's power. They can now open up the Erez crossing. And this morning, for the first time, hundreds of trucks of aid went into northern Gaza. Why? Because there are no more Hamas guys in northern Gaza. And the guys that are there are hiding well deep underground. So now we can see humanitarian aid coming. So it's a very difficult issue, and the complexity has to be emphasized to intelligent kids. Your kids are intelligent. I know them. So good. I said, another question. Jay, all the way in the back. You're going to have to shout, sir, because I can hear you. I can see you, but I can't hear you.
Thank you, Rabbi. A follow-up to a question you asked. I have a daughter who's a junior in high school.
Yeah.
Bright kid. And
Yes.
I'm conflicted in terms of, do we go to BYU or Brandeis or University of Florida and say, screw the far-left, woke, Hamas-loving Ivy League? Or is it like, no, why should we as Jews have to surrender and not go to these world-class or once
So
world-class institutions?
Jay's question is, he has a child who's a junior in high school who's beginning to ask questions about where she might go to university. And the question is, on the one hand, do we go to those universities that protect Jewish kids, or do we see that as capitulation to the bad guys and we go and confront them on other campuses? What should we do? And Jay, my Zayda used to say, Schwerze sein Yid. Sometimes it's hard to be Jewish. It involves hard choices. And I love your kid. So I'll talk to you about that after the session. What do you think, Steve? Where would you send a kid today?
University of Pennsylvania. I know I went there, but I'm selling it because I have to promote my alma mater. But those kinds of schools, precisely because your kid probably is going to be able to stand up for herself or himself in a way that can defend what she believes in. And I say the job here is not to lose that base, but to be present and challenge those administrators and those faculty persons, as difficult as it is.
And it's only $75,000 a year. Cheap. I mean, it's actually cheap. David.
So I was raised in a generation of post-Holocaust.
Yeah.
My kids post-Holocaust.
Yes.
Now we're going to go post-Holocaust.
Yes.
What is it we are going to become? What is it we should become? How do we not just wander into just the world shape us? How do we shape ourselves?
All right. So the question is, this next generation is now many generations away from Holocaust, many generations away from the founding of the State of Israel. Okay. And the question is, what is the, let me rephrase it if just okay, like, what is the image of Jewish being, Jewish identity that we want to offer these kids at this point? You want to try that?
You're the rabbi.
Tonight you are, so I will in a minute.
You're ordaining Ronnie Wilson.
And I'll ordain you too.
That's a great question. I think it's all about excellence, pride, the historic model, the capacity to draw out of Jewish history those things that really are distinctive about us. Not necessarily the tragedies of Jewish history, but the messaging of Jewish history. What do we have to say about the world and about life that really gives us something that has currency beyond ourselves and that has meaning for our kids, but also hopefully has meaning for a world that is in search of something more sustainable and holistic. So I think it's an extraordinary time for rabbis to be teaching us really the essence of Judaism in a redefined way.
And when the crisis first happened, I was asked to speak to lots of high school groups. And I said to the kids, same thing, two thoughts in your head at the same time. Be careful, because it turns out the world's more dangerous than we thought it was. But here's the second thought. I do not want you to define yourself as a victim. We are not victims. First of all, we're awfully powerful. And second of all, we have a very, very long history of remarkable cultural creativity and spiritual resilience. If there's any group in the world that knows how to survive catastrophe, it's us. Because honestly, let's go to your first comment, post-Holocaust. There was absolutely no sociological reason in the world why the Jewish people should have survived the Holocaust. A third of our people, the most committed of our people, destroyed in the most brutal way by the Nazis. If the Jewish people, the day after the Holocaust, had thrown their hands in the air and said, "Master of the world, take back your Torah, we don't want it no more," it would have been perfectly reasonable. But you people are stubborn. Moses was right. You're a stiff-necked people. And you said, not only are we not going to give up, but the greatest moment of Jewish creativity and assertion took place right after the Shoah. Think of all the synagogues, summer camps, seminaries, federation institutions, the whole structure of American Jewish life built after 1945. Think of the entire state of Israel built after 1948. Think of the liberation of Jews from Arab countries, from Yemen, from the former Soviet Union, and now from Ethiopia. See those pictures of Ethiopian kids? Unbelievable, right? 7-foot African Jews. I love it. I love it. I mean, think about this. Think about there is something in this people that refuses to die. That's what we're going to reach for now, because that's what we need right now. And if we define ourselves as victims, we suppress that part of ourselves. If we define ourselves as people living in an unredeemed world, a broken world, and tikkun is our mission, we'll figure this out. We're in the middle of a crisis right now. Give us a day or two, right? I invited Stephen because he has this wonderful mind for this sort of stuff. But most of us are like, we just read the New York Times in the morning, take 2 aspirin, go back to bed, right? We will figure this out. We are in the midst of this exact process. Right, okay, I got a couple of more, David, and then we're gonna, I know there's lots of people want to ask questions. I know, but I got a little bit of time, and please go ahead.
Have progressives, including progressive Jews,
Yeah.
fallen into the trap of saying what they feel is politically correct as opposed to what is accurate?
Yeah, let's just ask the question this way. What the hell happened to progressives? Why are they suddenly so unprogressive?
Well, we believe about 8% of American Jews would describe themselves as progressive. Now, whether or not all of them hold to some of the same ideologies that the progressive movements themselves put forward, I don't know. But we are certainly aware that this is a relatively significant part of a community. And my sense is that they come to this from 3 sort of spaces. One is a sense of defensiveness. They're Jewish, but they're uncomfortable when Israel or other Jewish matters become problematic. And so they seek a way to assimilate or to engage with the broader cultural theme. The second is a group who seriously believe that nationalisms, including Zionism, are problematic because they're sort of too self-centered. They're focused on the innard systems of community and should be concerned about more global or universal principles. And I think a third element of this are folks who have just really never acculturated to what I think has happened in much of the American Jewish experience from after 67 and well beyond, where they simply do not have a particular sort of affinity that Jewishness is more than simply a set of ideas or beliefs, but it's also got some emotional and internalized either values or feeling tones. And that's simply not part of the world in which they grew up, because they were far more sort of integrated into other cultural and social movements and models. And some of this comes from the fact of higher rates of intermarriage, of greater assimilation, part of the American story, and less so of the sort of defining Jewish story.
Great. I want to thank Professor Windmuller for being with us tonight. I want to thank Alana for all of her efforts with the technical and setup of this tonight. And please be reminded once again, if you show up next Wednesday night, it's going to be a lovely night, because the Jewish Women's Theater, The Braid, is going to be here with a wonderful program about immigration. But our class is going to continue next Thursday night with my dear friend Donnie Mossing. Thanks for being here.